This is not a room. It is a declaration. William Randolph Hearst did not build a house on this California hilltop. He built an argument in stone, in tapestry, in imported marble, that one man's will could suspend time itself. These tapestries were woven in Flanders in the 16th century. Hunters and hounds in darkened forests, fixed in wool for 400 years. They crossed an ocean to hang here. Someone, this morning, must dust them. Hearst called this his ranch. His guests called it extraordinary. The dining hall could seat 50 beneath its hammer beam ceiling. Above the table, the silk banners of medieval Italian guilds hung from walls that had never known the cities that made them. The silver was monogrammed. The crystal was Venetian. The linen was French. And there, between the candelabras, stood a bottle of Heinz ketchup. Hearst insisted. No amount of European grandeur could persuade him to eat without it. He was, above all else, a man who read. 40,000 books in this room alone. The carved walnut shelves rose to a Gothic vault that had once sheltered prayer. Now it sheltered appetite for news, for history, for the world he intended to shape. From this desk, Hearst commanded 28 newspapers, 13 magazines, and a radio network that reached 40 million Americans. The medieval room around him was theater. The papers on that desk were power. He placed a Roman swimming pool on a California mountain at 5,000 feet and surrounded it with marble columns he had shipped from Europe. It was, by any reasonable measure, an impossible thing to have done. He found this entirely satisfying. The temple facade at the pool's end is genuine ancient Roman marble, disassembled in Europe and reassembled here. 2,000 years of Mediterranean history, relocated to serve as backdrop for a morning swim. The Romans, once suspects, would have understood. Beneath the main house, hidden from the California sun, Hearst built a second pool entirely underground. Its ceiling, walls, and floor are covered in more than 1 million pieces of gold Venetian glass. It is the most beautiful room no one was meant to need. Each tessera was set by hand. Each piece chosen for its angle, its reflective quality, its position in the larger design. The craftsman worked for years in this chamber. The result is not a swimming pool. It is a temple that happens to hold water. The bedroom ceiling is Spanish, 15th century painted blue with gold stars, removed from a convent and brought here intact. Hearst slept beneath the prayers of medieval nuns without, apparently, any discomfort. The kitchen never rested. For each meal served in the great hall above, dozens of hands worked below chopping, roasting, plating, tining. The grandeur of the dining room was manufactured here, in heat and noise and relentless effort. The pantry held enough provisions to feed a village. Hearst entertained continuously and expected abundance. Supply trucks climbed the private road 3 times a week. The mountain consumed what the valley produced. Hollywood came to this hill. Charlie Chaplin, Clark Gable, Cary Grant, they sat in these red velvet seats and watched films that had not yet been released to the public. Hearst received the prints in advance. He usually had notes. The projectionist worked alone in his booth. His name does not appear in the guest lists. He threaded the film, focused the lens, and held the light steady while the famous watched below. This, too, was a kind of service. On any summer evening in the 1930s, this room might hold the most famous faces in America. They drank, they argued, they performed for each other. And above them, the Flemish hunting scenes watched with the patient indifference of things that have seen everything. Before the guests arrived, before the day declared itself, the pool held only its own reflection. The Roman columns, the California sky, the still water, all perfectly doubled, perfectly silent. It was at its most beautiful when no one was there to admire it. Behind every grand room, a narrow corridor. The servants moved through these passages unseen, carrying coal, carrying trays, carrying the weight of other people's comfort. The architecture of luxury always has a hidden skeleton. The morning after a dinner, the great hall returned to itself. The linen came down. The silver was collected. The chairs remembered their positions. The cleaning of a feast is always quieter and more honest than the feast itself. He called it La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill. Standing before it at the end of a California day, with the Pacific burning at the horizon and the towers catching the last light, the name does not seem excessive. The sculptures had been made for temples, for public squares, for the households of Roman senators. Now they stood in California, in a room hung with Flemish wool, lit by Gothic windows. They had survived everything. They were not surprised. The fireplace is the room's oldest truth. Strip away the tapestries and the gilt frames and the imported marble, and what remains is this: a man, a fire, and the night outside. Even Hearst came to this eventually. The wine cellar held thousands of bottles, catalogued by vintage and region. A sommelier decanted each selection with the ceremony it deserved. Hearst himself drank very little. The ritual was not for him. It was for the idea of the house. The processional banners were carried through Italian streets in the 14th century, civic pride made visible in silk and embroidery. Here, they hang in permanent stillness above a California dinner table. They have traveled further than any procession intended. The manuscripts were 800 years old. Their painted initials, in lapis, in vermilion, in gold leaf applied by a monk's careful breath, were still vivid. Hearst collected them as others collect stamps. The scale of his obsession defies ordinary accounting. He worked through the night. While his guests slept in rooms decorated with medieval tapestries and Renaissance ceilings, Hearst sat at his desk in shirt sleeves, correcting galley proofs. The empire required constant attention. It always does. They swam in the shadow of a Roman temple on a California mountain in the 1930s. This was the world Hearst had constructed for them, improbable, beautiful, entirely his own. Most guests stopped questioning it after the second day. At night, the pool lit from below. The aquamarine water threw its light upward onto the marble columns in a way that no Roman engineer had ever intended. The ancient and the modern conspired here to produce something neither could have made alone. Look down, and the gold vault is above you. Look down further, and it is below you too, reflected perfectly in the still water. In this room, Hearst achieved something architecture rarely manages, a space that seems to have no floor. To swim here was to move through someone's dream. The gold tessera shifted with the water's movement. The light changed with every stroke. Guests came down the stairs as visitors. They left as participants in something they could not quite name. From the highest rooms of the castle, the view stretched 100 miles along the California coast. Hearst built upward deliberately to stand above the horizon, above the fog, above every other claim on this landscape. The view was not an amenity. It was a statement of position. The bed was carved in Spain in the 15th century, its canopy posts worn smooth by 500 years of hands. It had held the sleep of nobles, merchants, perhaps clergy. Now it held the sleep of the most powerful newspaper publisher in American history. The wood did not distinguish. The light from the projector cut through the darkness like a convection. In the 1930s, cinema was the most powerful medium in the world. Hearst understood this before almost anyone. He sat in this room and watched it happen. Champagne before the film. Conversation carefully calibrated, laughter precisely timed. Hearst's castle operated on its own social grammar, and his guests learned it quickly. The reward for compliance was the most extraordinary hospitality in California. The kitchen began its day before the sun cleared the hills. By the time the first guest descended for breakfast, 2 hours of invisible work had already been completed. This is the physics of hospitality at scale. Comfort requires labor that must never be seen. 3 times a week, the trucks came up the mountain. Fresh salmon from the Pacific, artichokes from the valley, champagne from the warehouse below. The castle consumed without pause. The logistics of sustaining this place were, in their own way, as impressive as the architecture. The corridors of Casa Grande are lined with Spanish choir stalls, ancient wood carved for the contemplation of God, now serving as decoration for a private hallway. Between them hang Egyptian reliefs older than Christianity. The house was chronologically impossible and entirely deliberate. Not every hour at the castle was occupied with grandeur. Hearst believed his guests should be entertained continuously. The billiard room offered a respite from magnificence, a game, a drink, the comfortable compression of a smaller space after the vast halls above. Tea was served at 4. Always. The routine was non-negotiable. In the midst of all this excess, Hearst maintained the rituals of an English country house, because routine, more than marble, is what makes a place feel inhabited. The guest cottages were each a house in their own right, Spanish tiles, carved ceilings, medieval paintings on the walls. To be a guest here was to inhabit a room assembled from 5 centuries of European craft. The word cottage bore no resemblance to the reality. The arrival was choreographed. The long road up the mountain, the first sight of the towers, the ascent of the stone stairs, Hearst designed the approach as carefully as the house. By the time you reached the door, you had already surrendered to the scale of it. Drained, the pool revealed itself as pure engineering, tons of marble, hundreds of feet of pipe, a hydraulic system of considerable complexity. The beauty required constant maintenance. Most beautiful things do. An incunabulum is a book printed before the year 1500. Hearst owned dozens. They sat behind glass in his library, their Gothic typefaces unchanged from the day Gutenberg's press first made them possible. He bought them at auction, for sums that made curators weep. The first room inside the door held Egyptian statues 3,000 years old and Roman columns that had stood in the Mediterranean sun before California had a name. Hearst placed them at his threshold to establish, immediately, the terms of the conversation. As the Pacific extinguished the day, the guests gathered on the terrace. This was the hour Hearst designed the castle around, the moment when the view, the architecture, and the company converged into something that felt, briefly, like enough. At breakfast, the formalities relaxed slightly. The medieval hall at 8 in the morning, with the newspapers distributed and the coffee poured, was still extraordinary, but it was also, in its way, domestic. Even Hearst had to eat. Every evening, after the swimmers had gone, the maintenance crew descended. In the underground chamber with their work lamps and pull brushes, they cleaned the gold mosaic with the same diligence with which a museum conservator cleans a painting. Because that is, in fact, what it was. The staff ate in a room with bare walls and a bare bulb. Bread, soup, cold meat, the food of people who had spent the morning preparing other people's food. There were no chandeliers. There was, however, 15 minutes of genuine rest. To wake in a Hearst guest room was to open your eyes onto a 15th century Spanish painting in here, through the Moorish arch window, the Pacific far below. The disorientation was complete and, for most guests, entirely pleasurable. The marble torsos had been made for Greek temples, for Roman baths, for the contemplation of physical perfection by citizens of dead civilizations. Here, against the Flemish tapestries, they continued their ancient argument about the beauty of the human form. The argument was unresolved. It always is. The upper corridors held paintings that in any other house would have been the crowning achievement of a collection. Here, they lined the hallways. A Dutch Golden Age interior, a Flemish landscape, a Renaissance devotional panel, the everyday furniture of a private world. Breakfast beside the Roman pool, with the California coast below and the temple facade reflected in the water before you. The silver coffee service gleamed in the morning light. It is possible to become accustomed to extraordinary things. It is also possible to forget that most people never encounter them. They pinned their maps to the bookshelves and made decisions that would reach 40 million readers. A medieval library, a modern media empire. Hearst understood that power, in any century, requires a room where decisions are made and a desk where they are signed. The gardens were planted in the Italian tradition, geometric, controlled, formal in their assertion of human will over natural growth. Gardeners pruned and watered and carried daily. The beauty of a formal garden is also the record of the labor that makes it. When the rugs were rolled back and the jazz ensemble took its place before the stone fireplace, the assembly room became something its medieval builders never imagined, a dance floor in California, alive with the sound of a new century celebrating itself. The ceiling is Italian, 16th century dark chestnut beams with painted coffers in gold and crimson and blue. It was removed from a palazzo in Venice or Florence or Rome and reassembled here, panel by panel, one courtyard section at a time. Above your head, another continent's history. At night, the entrance lanterns turned the carved stone warm amber. Arriving in the dark, after the long road up the mountain, to find the towers lit and the door open, it was theater of the highest order. Hearst was always directing. 5 cooks moving simultaneously, each responsible for a different element of a 5-course dinner for 40 guests. The heat was intense. The timing was absolute. Failure was not possible because the alternative to success was telling William Randolph Hearst the dinner would be late. Even the changing rooms were tiled in Moorish geometric patterns. There was no room in this castle that had not been considered, decorated, resolved. The obsessive attention to every surface, even this one, seen only briefly by people removing their shoes, was Hearst's defining characteristic. The cocktail hour existed, for Hearst, as a precise instrument. The guests were gathered, the view was deployed, the drinks were served. By the time they descended to dinner, they had been softened by the Pacific sky and one perfectly made martini. The evening was already won. In the early hours, before the guests descended, a single figure moved through the great hall collecting the ash of last night's fire. The room had no memory of last evening's laughter. It was already reset, immaculate, prepared to perform again. The table was set to the millimeter. Silver charger plates engraved with the Hearst monogram. 3 glasses, 3 forks, linen pressed to the smoothness of paper. Between the candelabras, the ketchup bottle. The contrast was not accidental. It was a signature. The Pacific fog came in from the coast most mornings, filling the valleys and dissolving the lower hillside. Above it, the twin towers of Casa Grande emerged in isolation, a Spanish castle floating in a California cloud. For a moment each day, the improbability was complete. Between courses, the credenza held the silver. A footman stood beside it, hands behind his back, absolutely still, while the guests talked above the din of crystal and conversation. His stillness was as practiced and precise as any skill in the building. The moment of entry, the diver's body breaking the surface of the Roman pool, the white column of bubbles rising, the water closing over, was an ordinary act of pleasure inside an extraordinary frame. This was the point. The ordinary and the magnificent, daily in contact. They were awake at 5. The coal was heavy and the stairs were steep and the corridor was lit by a single bulb. No one who slept above them in carved walnut beds would know what time this world began. That invisibility was structural. It was built into the house. Breakfast in the California sun, above the fog line, with the coast below and the silver service on white linen. In July, there was nowhere on earth quite like this hilltop. Hearst knew it. His guests, to their credit, knew it too. The rugs were Safavid, Caucasian, Ottoman, each a century or more old, each a record of a weaver's lifetime encoded in knots per inch and dye lot and pattern. Hearst walked across them every day without one suspects considering this. But the rugs did not require his consideration. They were already permanent. The moment the house lights came up was always interesting. The spell broke. The conversation returned. People who had been silent and absorbed for 2 hours became themselves again opinionated, restless, already recounting to each other what they had just seen together. Inside the towers, the stone is plain. No ornament. No gilding. The Churrigueresque carvings that make the exterior so remarkable are a skin applied to a structure of solid California limestone. The beauty is real. The engineering behind it is more honest, and in its way more impressive. When the California morning light entered through the Gothic windows, it found the tapestries first. The faded burgundy and hunter green of the Flemish wool came briefly alive, not restored, but revealed. This was the room's best hour. It occurred when no one was watching. The refectory tables were made from single planks of English oak, 7 inches thick. They had been in use in a monastery in Flanders for 300 years before Hearst acquired them. They will outlast this building, and the next, and possibly the civilization that built both. Among the books, the manuscripts, the antiquities, a collection of ancient coins. Greek, Roman, Byzantine. Each one small enough to hold in one finger and thumb, each one older than the religion that built the room around them. Hearst collected them for their touch as much as their value. The marble steps leading into the pool were worn slightly smooth, not by antiquity, but by the accumulated descents of decades of swimmers. The castle was young enough that its wear was human in origin. Every smooth edge here was someone's foot, someone's afternoon, someone's summer. The descent to the Roman pool began before you arrived. The staircase walls were mosaic. The staircase ceiling was mosaic. Hearst and his architect Julia Morgan made the approach part of the destination, so that by the time you reached the pool, you had already been absorbed into its logic. The ceiling of the celestial suite was painted in a Spanish convent in the 15th century. The nuns who slept beneath its blue and gold stars believed it was a representation of the eternal heavens above them. It still is. The address has changed. The stars have not. The butcher block island held the evidence of the morning's preparation, stains, cuts, the ghost impressions of every meal ever prepared on its surface. This was the most honest surface in the building, unpretentious, used, marked by the actual work of feeding 40 people 3 times a day. Charlie Chaplin visited the castle many times. He sat in these seats and watched prints of his own films with Hearst's guests, sometimes laughing, sometimes silent. The comedian in the private theater, watching himself. Even here, performance and reality were difficult to separate. Hearst collected weapons as he collected everything comprehensively, without apology, across every culture and century. Swords and armor and ceremonial daggers lined the corridors, their purpose long obsolete, their craft still speaking clearly after 500 years. The fireplace consumed a cord of wood in a single winter evening. In the morning, someone came for the ash. The same fireplace that impressed senators and film stars was, in the next hour, a job cold and grey and requiring a brush and a brass pan and patient hands. The bronze dolphin spouts at the pool's edge were cast in the first decade of the 20th century, their design taken from ancient Roman originals. The arc of water they projected each afternoon caught the California sun and held it briefly, spinning it into light. This was intended. The Roman pool held 400,000 gallons. Maintaining its clarity required a filtration system of considerable engineering, operating continuously behind mosaic walls that gave no hint of its existence. Perfection, here as elsewhere, required machinery hidden from the eye. Among the antiquities and manuscripts, small personal objects accumulated on the shelves, a stuffed hawk, a collection of quartz specimens from the California hills, arrowheads from the native peoples who had inhabited this mountain long before the Hearst family claimed it. After midnight, the great hall was empty. The candles were out. The banners hung in darkness. The table stretched its full length into the shadows, bare and silent. The hall that had been filled with noise and light and silver was, by 2 in the morning, simply an enormous medieval room in California. The fog arrived most mornings from the Pacific without announcement. It swallowed the gardens, the lower terraces, the view of the valley below. For a few hours each day, the hilltop was an island. The isolation Hearst had always sought was delivered, free of charge, by the California coast. The silver candelabras were lit each evening and extinguished each night. A footman made his circuit of the room, lighting each wick in sequence, the warm light spreading from candelabra to candelabra like a slow tide coming in. The room brightened by degrees into its evening self. The guest cottages were private enough for real conversation. Away from the grand communal rooms, guests found in these smaller spaces something the main house rarely offered: intimacy. Some of Hearst's most significant relationships, political, creative, personal, were conducted in these rooms. The pool's marble steps descended into water that was cool even in the California summer, fed by the mountain spring that Hearst had captured and redirected for precisely this purpose. The cold was a shock, every time. And every time, a pleasure. The morning fish delivery came packed in ice from Morro Bay, 30 miles south. Salmon, halibut, Pacific sole, the day's catch still cold from the ocean at the moment it arrived at the mountain kitchen. Between the sea and the silver platter, 4 hours and 6 pairs of hands. Chinese porcelain lined the upper corridors, blue and white conchi vases, famille rose bowls, Ming Dynasty platters in locked glass cases. Objects made for Chinese emperors in the 17th century now occupied a California hallway. Every object in this building had crossed at least one ocean to be here. The largest tapestry in the assembly room depicts a stag hunt, horses, hounds, noblemen in pursuit across a forest that exists nowhere in the natural world. It was woven in Brussels around 1520. The forest it depicts was already imaginary when it was made. Here, it is doubly so, a fictional European landscape on a California wall. Bread was baked in the castle's own ovens each morning. By the time it reached the table, still warm, in silver baskets lined with white linen, it had passed through 4 pairs of hands. The guests broke it without noticing. This, too, was the point. On one shelf, among the books, a rolled vellum map, a portolan chart of the Mediterranean, drawn by a Genoese cartographer in the 14th century. Its coastlines are recognizable but imprecise, its sea monsters decorative but earnest. It was made by someone who understood that to map a thing is to claim it. Hearst understood this too. The colonnaded walkways around the Neptune Pool were designed by Julia Morgan as a Mediterranean cloister, a covered passage between sun and shadow, between the main buildings and the pool terrace. She had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. She was the first woman to do so. The colonnades are the record of what that cost and what it made possible. The pool floor was tiled in a pattern of sea creatures, fish, starfish, seahorses, in dark blue and white on a gold ground. Beneath the water, the pattern was visible only in glimpses, distorted by depth and movement. A whole world, perpetually half-seen. The writing desk in the private sitting room held the small evidence of a personal life, letters in progress, an address book worn at the spine, a photograph in a plain silver frame. In a house of such conscious grandeur, these were the most revealing objects, the things too ordinary to have been collected. Ice cream was made in the kitchen's mechanical churn, using cream from the estate's own dairy herd that grazed the lower slopes of the hill. The dairy was below. The kitchen was above. The cream came up by hand. It always came up. On Saturday evenings, Hearst sometimes screened 2 films. The program was handwritten on a card in the vestibule. The projectionist loaded the reels in sequence. The guests ate and drank between features. It was, by any measure, the finest cinema in California. The linens were washed on the premises, in vast tubs in the lower service rooms. White linen, pressed to rigidity. Monogrammed towels, folded into specific geometries. The laundry operation was industrial in scale, invisible in practice, and conducted by people whose names are not in the guest registers. A century separates the newest bronze in this room from the oldest. A Roman horse in green verdigris. A Renaissance satyr in dark patina. A Hellenistic athlete in honey-colored bronze. 3 different civilizations, 3 different centuries, 3 different definitions of beauty. The room held them together without comment. The temple facade at the pool's end was not built. It was recovered. Ancient Roman marble, excavated in Europe and shipped to California in numbered crates. Julia Morgan reassembled it here like a puzzle whose original image no one entirely agreed on. The result, whatever it is genuine antiquity on an American mountain. The credenza held the silver service between courses, tureens and platters and sauceboats, each piece engraved with the Hearst H. The footman stood beside it without moving. His stillness was as much a part of the room's composition as the silver itself. On evenings when the editorial work was done and the guests were occupied elsewhere, Hearst sometimes returned to the manuscripts. He was not a scholar, but he had a collector's intimacy with his objects, the particular pleasure of holding something irreplaceable and knowing, for a moment, that it is yours. Hearst walked the terraces each morning before breakfast. It was the hour the castle belonged entirely to him, before the guests descended, before the staff had finished their invisible work. The Pacific below, the gardens around him, the towers above. He had built all of it. He knew every stone. Beneath the water, the swimmers cast moving shadows on the mosaic floor, dark shapes crossing the sea creatures and the gold and blue pattern below. Above the water, the gold vault reflected in the surface. The pool held 3 worlds simultaneously: air, water, mosaic. The human body passed through all 3. From the tower rooms, the entire California coast was visible on clear days, 100 miles of Pacific coastline, the Channel Islands as dark shapes at the horizon. Hearst had chosen this hill specifically for this view. The view was not incidental. It was the reason for everything. The breakfast buffet was assembled each morning with the same precision as a formal dinner. Croissants, brioche, poached eggs, fresh California fruit, silver coffee service all in place before 7. The production was invisible. The pleasure was entirely for others. The stone floor of the assembly room was laid in the 1920s, but it was quarried from the same California mountains that had always been here. Beneath the Persian rugs, beneath the Italian furniture, beneath everything imported and assembled and arranged, the original ground of this place remained. The windows of the Great Hall were fitted with antique Spanish ironwork grilles, their geometric patterns a language of security and decoration simultaneously. Through them, the California hills were always visible. Europe looked out at America. Neither flinched. When the rare Pacific storm came, the pool filled with rain as well as spring water. The Roman temple facade was gray and wet. The colonnade dripped. The marble went dark. The pool in a storm revealed what the pool always was beneath its beauty, a basin of water on a mountain, in weather, exposed to everything. Leaving the Roman pool at the end of an afternoon, climbing back up the mosaic staircase into the California evening, was a particular transition. The underground golden aquamarine gave way to the open air, the hills, the declining sun. The body, warm from the water, met the cooling mountain air. For a moment, every surface was sensation. In the lower shelves of the Gothic study, among the published books and the antiquities, the personal accumulated, a family photograph in a leather frame, a child's drawing in a simple mount, a stone from the California hillside placed on a shelf for no reason that could be catalogued. Even Hearst had a life that resisted collection. The departure was the reverse of the arrival, the cars at the foot of the stairs, the luggage carried down by hands that had carried it up, the guest turning at the car door for one last look at the towers. Most people, returning to their ordinary lives, said nothing. The scale of what they were leaving had not yet fully resolved into language. After midnight, the assembly room was returned to itself. The fire at embers. The tapestries in darkness. The brandy glass and the open book on the side table, the last evidence of an evening just concluded. The room had held 100 evenings like this one. It would hold 100 more. The morning after a large gathering, the pool was the first thing cleaned. The ground staff skimmed the surface, checked the filtration, tested the water. By 9 o'clock, the pool had no memory of the previous day. It was simply itself again, blue and still and waiting. Look closely at the processional banners, and the damage of time is readable in the silk, faded where the light has fallen for centuries, still vivid in the protected folds. They were made to be carried through streets, to declare a community's identity to itself. They ended their procession here, in California, permanently still. At the end of each season, Hearst made a circuit of the castle room by room, alone. He moved through the Gothic study, touched the books, checked the desk. He was not conducting an inspection. He was saying goodbye to something he would return to, and something that, in some part of him, he knew was finite. Each dawn, the towers of Casa Grande were the first structures on the California coast to catch the light. The Churrigueresque ornament, carved by Spanish craftsmen in the 1920s following century-old patterns, burned briefly gold before the sun climbed and flattened the shadows. It was the most honest moment of the day. The building, for a few minutes, looked exactly as it was intended to. The last swim of the summer season was always in October, when the coastal air had cooled and the water held the memory of summer warmth, but the season had already turned. The Roman temple, the marble columns, the California hills going gold and brown, the pool at its most beautiful was also the pool preparing to close. When the season ended, the dust sheets came out. The furniture was covered. The silver was stored. The fire was laid but not lit. The great hall, hung still with its Flemish tapestries and its Egyptian torsos and its centuries of accumulated claim, was left to itself. It had been performing for another year. Now, it rested. In May, the dust sheets came down. The windows were thrown open. The California spring light, green and clear and entirely unlike the light of any European room these objects had ever known, fell across the tapestries and the Persian rugs and the carved walnut choir stalls. The room woke. It was ready again. The first breakfast of the new season was always the same silver service, the same monogrammed linen, the newspaper folded beside the plate. Routine was Hearst's deepest architecture. Beneath all the grandeur, the structure of his days was as regular as the tides. Over the winter, the correspondence had accumulated telegrams, editorial memos, personal letters, requests, and demands from a media empire that did not pause because its owner was absent. The desk at the start of each season held the evidence, a mountain of paper, waiting. He sat down and began. The pool refilled in April. By May, the water had warmed enough for swimming. The first swimmer of the season broke a surface that had been still since October, still enough that the Roman temple and the California sky had been reflected there, undisturbed, for 6 months. In late spring, the angle of the California sun aligned with the oculus skylights in a way that filled the underground chamber with a quality of light that was neither the flat gray of winter nor the brilliant heat of August, but something in between, precise and unrepeatable, occurring only in May and only for a few days. The gold mosaic, in this light, appeared to breathe. The portrait above the console table was not of an ancestor. Hearst's family, for all its ambition, was recent money. His grandfather had been a Missouri farmer. The painting was purchased, not inherited. In this castle of assembled genealogies, even the family portrait was an acquisition. For servants, 1 table, 40 places. The mathematics of formal service were exacting, each measurement checked, each glass positioned to the fraction of an inch. To observe this preparation was to understand that luxury, at its most extreme, becomes a form of obsessive labor masquerading as effortlessness. The telephone lines ran from this hilltop to San Francisco, to Los Angeles, to New York. At 11 at night, when reasonable men slept, Hearst called his editors. The medieval room around him was unchanged from the afternoons when senators visited. The Gothic vault was indifferent to the hour. The marble coping of the Neptune Pool came from the same quarries that supplied ancient Rome. Hearst's architects specified the exact grade. It was warm in the California sun and cool in the morning shade. To sit on it, feet in the water, looking at the Roman temple, was to inhabit, briefly, a beautiful anachronism. The vault above the Roman pool was built in the 1920s by craftsmen working from designs drawn by Julia Morgan. It is not ancient. It is a creation of the 20th century, made to feel eternal. The distinction matters less than you might expect. In this room, the illusion and the reality produce the same gold light. The ritual of dressing for dinner at Hearst Castle was not optional. Formal dress was expected. The lady's maid who adjusted the ham, the footman who laid out the evening coat, their work was the invisible preparation for the visible performance of the evening above. The pastry section of the kitchen operated on a different clock to the rest, longer, more precise, governed by the logic of temperature and chemistry rather than the imperatives of service. The pastry chef worked alone most of the time. Perfection, in pastry as in architecture, required solitude. The hand-lettered program card in the theater vestibule was renewed each week. A new film, sometimes two. Hearst received the prints from the studios directly, often before their general release. To be a guest at the castle in the 1930s was to live, briefly, slightly ahead of the present. The room service breakfast was a precise object, the silver pot, the single flower, the newspaper folded to the day's date. It was carried up from the kitchen by a footman who had been awake since 5, who knocked once and left the tray outside the carved oak door, and who did not wait to be thanked. The lighting of the candelabras was a ritual repeated every evening for the duration of the season. It transformed the room, the flat afternoon light replaced, candle by candle, with something warmer, more mutable, more forgiving. Architecture can be designed for many kinds of light. This room was designed for this one. At dawn, the Neptune Pool held two skies, one above and one below. The Roman temple in the still water was as precise as the original. The California hills were dark. The first light, before the sun cleared the ridge, was entirely without shadow. In this light, the pool was not a pool. It was a mirror held up to morning. The carpets were older than the room they lay in, older than the building, older than California as a name. The Safavid weavers who made them had never heard of America. Their work crossed continents and centuries and came to rest under the feet of a newspaper publisher who walked across them every day without removing his shoes. After dinner, the silver coffee service appeared at the head of the table. The servants moved the chairs. The formal distances of the meal dissolved into the easier proximities of coffee and brandy. These were the conversations Hearst valued most when the performance of dinner had ended and the actual thinking could begin. The private patio of Casa del Sol was the smallest space on the estate and possibly the most peaceful. The Moorish fountain. The lavender. The dappled shade of the lemon tree. In the midst of all the grandeur, Hearst's architects had preserved these intimate corners, understanding that spectacle, unrelieved, becomes exhausting. The fireplace mantel is a 16th-century Italian original, carved in Lombardy, possibly Florence, from grey limestone that has since absorbed centuries of fire and time into its surface. The porcelain vases on its shelf were made in China for the Dutch export trade around 1700. The bronze horse before them is Greek, circa 350 BC. The mantel is the densest square meter in the building. From this height, the California coast curved away in both directions, north toward San Francisco, south toward Los Angeles. Below, the valleys were green or gold depending on the season. The Pacific was always blue. Hearst had paid an enormous sum to stand here. Looking at this, it is difficult to argue he overpaid. Neptune rides his sea chariot across the Bolton, thousands of individual glass pieces, each tessera placed by a craftsman who understood that at the viewing distance of a swimming pool, the eye would resolve the fragments into a figure. The technique is Byzantine, 1,000 years old. The swimming pool beneath it is 1930s California. The combination should be absurd. It is instead magnificent. Before mechanical refrigeration was universal, ice was a logistical achievement. Hearst's kitchen maintained commercial ice chests restocked by daily delivery. The ice pick, the tongs, the zinc-lime cabinet, the cold chain that kept the champagne and the salmon, this was the unsexy infrastructure of aristocratic pleasure. The map on the wall was not decorative. Cities circled in pencil, newspaper circulation figures in the margins, distribution routes marked in red. This was the actual map of Hearst's empire, not the medieval one his room suggested, but the American one he had spent 50 years building from San Francisco to New York. When the Pacific sky burned at the end of the day, the Neptune Pool became something no Roman engineer had ever designed: a mirror for a California sunset, its orange and gold light thrown back at the sky from the still surface of the water. The ancient and the accidental produced, together, something neither had planned. The carved choir stalls were made in Spain in the 15th century for a community of monks who would pray and sing in them for the span of their lives. Their carved misericords, the small ledges that allowed the monks to rest while appearing to stand, are worn smooth by 5 centuries of weight. The prayers the monks said in them are gone. The wear of their bodies remains. Hearst installed bathrooms of extraordinary quality throughout the castle: Carrara marble, chrome fittings, monogrammed linen. Hot water was supplied by a boiler system that required constant maintenance by staff who were never seen. Comfort, at this level, is a form of engineering. The carpets lay 3 deep in the assembly room, a safavid beneath a Turkish beneath a Caucasian, their borders overlapping at the edges. They were old enough that the dyes in them were made from plants and insects that no longer exist in quantity. The red of the largest carpet was made from the dried bodies of an insect harvested in Mexico. Even the color has a history. The 35mm film projector was the most modern object in the most medieval building in California. Its sprockets and lamp housing and take-up reels were precision engineering of the 1930s, installed in a room of carved stone and antique tapestries. Technology and antiquity shared this booth without negotiation. Neither blinked. At night, lit from below by iron lanterns, the towers of Casa Grande looked most genuinely like what Hearst had always intended them to be: not a reproduction, not a fantasy, but a castle. The California darkness was absolute enough that the hills and the century disappeared, and what remained was stone, light, and the old insistence of a man who believed that beauty, made permanent, was the closest thing to forever. 2 people in the largest room in the building, separated by 60 feet of Persian rug and 500 years of Flemish weaving, each entirely absorbed in their own world. This was, finally, what the room was for. Not performance. Not display. But the possibility, inside all this grandeur, of being genuinely alone. Hearst sat at the head of his table and looked down its full length, the candelabras receding in perspective, the silver catching the candlelight, the guests arranged in the hierarchy of his hospitality. He had built the table, acquired the silver, hired the staff, and assembled the guests. He was, simultaneously, host and architect of every evening he presided over. The ancient coins were held in shallow drawers lined with velvet, each in its own indentation, each labeled in a librarian's careful hand. Greek silver, Roman gold, Byzantine bronze. The empires that minted them had fallen. Their currency, outlasting them by 2,000 years, rested here in California, in a drawer. Julia Morgan designed the Neptune Pool colonnade after years of study in France and a lifetime of practice in California. The proportions are classical but not imitative, the columns slightly heavier than their Greek originals, adjusted for the California scale of the landscape behind them. She understood that classical architecture, transplanted, must adapt or become pastiche. She adapted. The decision to mosaic the staircase as well as the pool chamber was Morgan's. She understood that architecture is experienced in sequence, not in a single glance. The approach matters as much as the destination. The mosaic staircase is the preparation for the mosaic room, a gradual immersion that begins before the water does. The Spanish ceiling had been painted by craftsmen whose names are not recorded, in a convent whose name Hearst may not have known, for women who would never leave the building that sheltered their prayers. It was removed, crated, shipped across the Atlantic, and reinstalled here. The stars it depicts are the same stars. The devotion that painted them has no address. The marks on the butcher block island were made by 1,000 meals, each cut, each trim, each season's work recorded in the wood. The block was scrubbed each night with salt and hot water. By morning, it was ready. By evening, it was marked again. This was its entire life. It had no other. In the 1930s, the most powerful media owner in America and the most famous comedian in the world sat in adjacent velvet seats on a California hilltop and watched moving pictures together. The century was new enough that this still seemed remarkable. Later, it would seem inevitable. The weapons in the corridor cases had killed no one for centuries. Removed from war and given to display, they became beautiful, the Damascus steel catching the corridor lamplight and the patterns of its folding, the chased silver on a ceremonial pistol precise as jewelry. Violence, at sufficient distance, becomes art. This is one of history's most persistent bargains. The Hearst estate required a staff of between 40 and 60 people to operate during the season. Each had a role that was specific, practiced, and essential to the whole. The person who cleaned the fireplace each morning, silent, invisible, bent over cold ash, was as necessary to the evening ahead as the cook, the sommelier, and the architect who designed the room. The dolphin head spouts were cast after Roman models found at Pompeii. Their bronze has aged in the California coastal air differently than it would have aged in Italy. The patina here is greener, thinner, more recent in appearance. Even the corrosion is a record of displacement. The engineering required to keep the Roman pool functioning was substantial and entirely invisible. Pumps, filters, chemical treatments, drainage systems, all operating behind the mosaic walls, accessible through service passages that no guest ever entered. The perfection of the visible space was maintained by the imperfection of the hidden infrastructure. Among 10,000 collected objects, a single ordinary stone from the California hillside sat on a shelf. No label. No provenance. It was there because someone had picked it up and put it there, and no one had moved it. In a house dedicated to the permanent and the irreplaceable, the small ordinary thing was the most personal object in the room. At 2 in the morning, the great hall was a different place. The same room, the same ceiling, the same banners, but emptied of the performance that animated it. The table stretched its full length into the dark. Outside the windows, the California hills. The room, alone, was simply what it was, an enormous stone space-on with very old cloth. The Pacific fog arrived without announcement and departed the same way. For the hours it covered the lower hillside, the castle was genuinely isolated, the road below invisible, the valley silent, the estate reduced to its own hilltop world. Hearst had sought this isolation deliberately. The fog provided it, daily, free of charge. The silver candelabras held 12 candles each. Lit, they produced a light that electricity cannot replicate, moving, warm, responsive to breath and draught, casting shadows that shifted with the fire. Hearst could have lit the room with electricity. He chose, for the dining hours, not to. The guest cottages were, in their way, the most successful rooms on the estate. Smaller, warmer, more human in scale than the great house, they were the spaces where guests became themselves. The conversations that mattered happened here, in rooms with Spanish tiles and medieval ceilings, over coffee brought by a footman who knocked once and did not linger. The pool steps were worn smooth not by age, but by accumulation. Every summer for 20 years, the same descent, the cold shock of the water, the step down onto the mosaic floor of the shallow end, the moment of adjustment before the first stroke. The marble remembered each entry, collectively, in its surface. The morning fish arrived packed in ice, still cold from the ocean 30 miles away. In the kitchen, it was received, assessed, divided, and assigned to the evening's menu within the hour. Between the sea and the silver platter, a chain of invisible labor that the diner at table experienced only as freshness. The Chinese porcelain in the upper corridor had been made for Chinese emperors in the 17th century, objects of state and ceremony in one civilization, now domestic decoration in another. Their blue and white surfaces were unchanged. Their context had shifted by 10,000 miles in 300 years. The hunting scene in the tapestry, the horses, the hounds, the antlered stag caught at the moment before, was woven in Brussels by craftsmen working from cartoons designed by painters whose names are partially known. It took 3 years to make. It has lasted 5 centuries. The hunt it depicts never happened. The craft that made it is irrefutable. The bread arrived at the table warm, in silver baskets, having been baked in the castle's own ovens 3 hours before. It was the most ordinary thing on the table and, to any guest who thought about it, the most intimate, the daily staple, made by hand, offered without ceremony in the middle of all the ceremony. The portolan chart on the shelf was made by a Genoese cartographer who had never seen the Pacific. Its coastlines were the best knowledge of a 14th-century sailor. California, in 1350, was an edge of the world not yet reached, not yet named, not yet imaginable as the site of this room, this shelf, this map. The colonnaded walkways that connected the pool to the main buildings were, in Julia Morgan's design, a moment of classical calm between the grandeur of the house and the spectacle of the pool. She understood pace, the rhythm of movement through architecture, the necessity of transition, the value of covered passage between magnificent spaces. On the pool floor, sea creatures made of tessera moved beneath the feet of swimmers who could only glimpse them through the water's distortion. A seahorse, a fish, a starfish, each made of hundreds of hand-set fragments that together produced a shape only visible from above. The craftsmen who set them worked from below, looking up. They never saw the finished design as the swimmer saw it. The writing desk in the private sitting room held, over the decades, a continuous stream of letters to editors, to politicians, to architects, to an actress, to children and grandchildren and the dead. Most of those letters are now in archives. The desk that held them is still here, in the room with the Spanish ceiling and the Gothic windows, empty and ready. Ice cream in the 1930s was a small daily luxury served between the fish and the roast, in crystal coupes, by white-gloved hands. It was made that morning in the kitchen below. The cream came from the estate's own dairy. The flavors were adjusted by a pastry chef who had trained in Paris and ended his career on a California mountain. 2 films in an evening was Hearst's preferred program. He was an impatient man with a vast appetite for narrative. The projectionist in the booth above loaded the second reel while the first still played. In the intermission, the silver tray circulated. The century's dominant art form, at its most private and most lavish. The laundry rooms in the basement never entirely stopped. Monogrammed linen, pressed to perfection, moved in a continuous cycle from body to basket to tub to iron to shelf to body again. The mountain of white cloth that sustained the castle's immaculateness was washed and rewashed by hands that are not in any photograph. Bronze survives everything. The patina on the oldest pieces in the assembly room was formed in the Mediterranean centuries before the Pacific coast of North America had a European name. These objects had passed through a dozen collections, crossed 2 oceans, survived wars and revolutions and the dissolution of the empires that commissioned them. They would outlast this building too, in all probability. They always do. The carved relief in the temple pediment depicted figures whose specific identities are disputed by archaeologists. They are Roman, certainly. They are ancient, unquestionably. What they represent, which gods, which myth, which moment of divine intervention, is less certain. Hearst did not require certainty. He required beauty. In this, as in so much else, he was not entirely wrong. Between courses, the silver waited on the credenza. The footman stood beside it without moving. In the great hall, this stillness was a form of professional perfection, the servant as furniture, as fixture, as part of the room's composition. It was asked of him every evening. He provided it. The asking and the providing are both part of the history of this room. The illuminated manuscript was 800 years old. Its painter had worked by candlelight, using a brush made of a single squirrel hair, mixing lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan with egg white to produce the blue of the Virgin's robe. Hearst had acquired it at auction for a sum that would have funded a monastery for a century. He kept it behind glass and sometimes, in the evenings, he opened the case. The morning walk was the private hour, before the guests, before the newspapers, before the telephone began. The terraces, the gardens, the view of the Pacific still grey in the early light. Hearst walked alone through what he had built, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has made something that will outlast him. It would. It does. The pool held 4 worlds at once, the gold vault above, its reflection in the water, the swimmers between them, and the mosaic floor below, barely visible through the depth. To be in this room while people swam in it was to understand that Hearst and Morgan had built something that could not be reduced to a category. It was not a pool. It was not a painting. It was not a temple. It was all three, simultaneously, in California. On clear winter days, from the tower rooms, the Channel Islands were visible dark profiles at the horizon, 60 miles offshore. They had been there before the Spanish came, before the Chumash, before the name California existed. The view from Hearst's highest rooms was a view into deep time. He may or may not have known this. The view was indifferent either way. The breakfast buffet represented 2 hours of invisible morning labor made available in the form of warm pastry and silver coffee service. The guests arrived at 8, still slow with sleep, and lifted lids from silver chafing dishes without considering who had arrived at 5, in the dark, to make the contents hot. The stone beneath the Persian rugs was laid by masons in the 1920s, quarried from the California hills by workers whose wages are recorded in ledgers held in the castle archive. The floor is not glamorous. It is load-bearing. It supports everything above it, the rugs, the furniture, the collections, the centuries, the guests, the whole improbable weight of Hearst's assembled world. The Spanish ironwork grills on the refectory windows were made by blacksmiths in Castile in the 16th century, their geometric patterns derived from Moorish mathematical traditions. Through them, the California hills were visible in every season. The grills framed a view that their makers had never imagined, in a landscape they had never seen, on a continent they had not known existed when the iron was still cooling. When a Pacific storm reached the hilltop, the Neptune Pool was indistinguishable from any other body of water in bad weather, gray, disturbed, cold. The Roman columns stood in the rain. The temple facade was wet stone. The beauty did not disappear exactly, but it retreated, leaving something older and more honest, a large structure of ancient material exposed to weather, which is what all architecture ultimately is. To climb the mosaic staircase at the end of an afternoon and emerge from the underground chamber into the California evening was a complete reversal of the senses. Gold tessera and still blue water gave way to open air, declining sun, and the vast Pacific horizon. The body, warmed from the pool, met the cooling mountain. Every surface changed at once. In the end, the most revealing objects in the Gothic study were the ones that could not be catalogued. A child's drawing in a simple frame. A stone from the hillside. A family photograph in a leather folder. These were the objects that accumulated without intention, the sediment of a life lived inside a collection, insisting, quietly, on the difference between the two. The departure from Hearst Castle followed a fixed ritual, the luggage brought down, the cars at the foot of the stairs, the host at the top step, formal, warm, already thinking of the next edition. Most guests left changed in some way they could not immediately articulate. The castle had shown them something about the relationship between beauty and power and cost that took time to process. Some never finished processing it. By midnight, the assembly room had released the evening. The fire was at embers. The tapestries held whatever the day had deposited in them, the conversations, the laughter, the music that had briefly filled the space between their wool and the painted ceiling. The room did not remember. But it had held it all, without judgment, as it had held everything for 20 years. The morning after a large gathering, the Neptune Pool was cleaned before anything else. The staff came at first light with their tools, skimming and brushing and testing, restoring the water to its daily perfection. By 9, there was no evidence of the previous day. The pool was itself again, blue, still, formal, and entirely ready for the next afternoon's pleasure. The silk of the processional banners has thinned over 6 centuries to a translucency that allows the light to pass through. In places, the embroidered thread is all that remains, the ground silk dissolved by time, leaving only the image, suspended in its own stitching. They are among the most fragile objects in the building. They are also among the most enduring. Hearst left the castle for the last time in 1947, aged 84, on the advice of his doctors. He did not know, at that moment, that it was the last time. He made his usual circuit of the rooms. He touched the books on the desk. He looked at the view from the Gothic study window, the California hills, the distant Pacific. Then he went down to the car. He did not return. Every morning, the towers catch the light before anything else on the California coast. They have done this since 1927, when the first section of the West Tower was completed. 100 years of dawns, each one different, each one finding the carved stone the same. The Churrigueresque saints in their niches have watched every one of them. They are not impressed. They were made for eternity, and eternity is patient. The last swimmer of the last season stood at the pool's edge in October and looked at the Roman temple reflected in the still water. The California hills were golden brown. The colonnade cast its afternoon shadows. In a few days, the canvas cover would come out. The water would go still for winter. The reflection would remain in the sky, the columns, the ancient pediment, for no one. The dust sheets are white. They cover what was purchased, assembled, arranged, polished, lit and inhabited for 20 years by the most powerful private individual in American history. Beneath them, the Flemish tapestries still hang. The Egyptian torsos still stand. The Persian rugs still lie on the California stone. The room does not require anyone to be magnificent. It simply is. It was built for permanence, and permanence, the one thing Hearst paid for without negotiation, is the one thing he actually received.